I thought I'd escaped. I swear I had. I'd cleaned myself up. The life of an FBI agent, especially when you're dealing with the things that never make it onto paper, those loose ends of the Cold War we insist on calling national security, my God, it's a slow poison. It's a kind of filth that sticks to your soul, and you only realize it once you're already turning to dust. When I hung up my badge about 3 years ago, I swore I'd never look at a classified folder again. I moved north, to Oregon. Bought a small cabin by a lake. The kind of place where the only thing that wakes you up is the sound of a duck fighting over food. I was fishing, living on weak coffee and silence. Then the phone rang. And you know how it is. A phone ringing when you're hiding never brings good news. It's never your mother calling to ask about a cake recipe. It's always the past, with a hoarse voice that smells of mothballs and old gunpowder. It was Davis. Old Davis, who was actually younger than me, but had that sandpaper voice that sounded like it had smoked 3 centuries worth of bad cigarettes. He didn't ask. He ordered. There was no, hello, or, how are you, Arthur? Vance, you need to come back to Nevada. Now. I sighed, and the sound came out heavy, like I was lifting the weight of years. Davis, you know I'm retired. Legally. I don't even know where my service weapon is anymore. I'm fishing. I know exactly where you are, Arthur. And I know you're lying about the gun. But that's not why I'm calling. It's Miller. He's missing. Sam Miller.
Yeah, Miller.
You need to understand what Miller meant to me. He wasn't just my partner. He was the only guy who understood what we did, the price we paid. Miller was my moral compass in a world with no true north. He was the kind of agent who still believed in justice, even after seeing what he and I had seen. And what we'd seen, well, we'd seen the holes the government digs to hide things. Miller doesn't just vanish, Davis. He disappears when he wants to be found, or he's neck-deep in some old archival mess. Not this time. He was at Area 731. His equipment was found. Just the equipment. And the last report he sent to HQ, it didn't make any sense. Random words, wrong dates, and constant references to residual resonance. I dropped my fishing rod onto the ground. The lake stopped looking blue and calm and started looking black and bottomless. Area 731. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with Oregon's mild weather. Area 731 wasn't just a patch of desert in southern Nevada. It was where we buried secrets that couldn't see daylight. It was a place that smelled like sand, faint radiation, and lies. During the Cold War, that stretch of land was used for nuclear tests that, according to the official story, just kicked up dust and killed a few rabbits. But Miller and I knew the truth. We'd read the original reports, the brown folders sealed with a dozen red stamps. Especially the infamous Report 731. Let me explain something. When you detonate a nuclear bomb underground, you're not just making a hole. You're releasing energy that science can barely measure. And back then, they weren't being careful. They were testing limits. What Report 731 hinted at, between the lines and in erased margin notes, was that those explosions hadn't just blown apart the earth. They'd torn something. Miller had become obsessed with it. He used to say the Nevada desert wasn't just a graveyard of warheads, it was a graveyard of time. Arthur, you're the only one who knows what he was looking for, Davis went on, his voice low, almost a whisper, which was scarier than if he'd been yelling. No one else will touch that site. It's classified again, above clearance level. If you don't go, we'll have to list Miller as a deserter. And you know what that means for his family. No pension. No honors. Nothing. Classic blackmail. Davis knew exactly where to press. It wasn't loyalty to the Bureau. It was loyalty to Sam Miller. Send me the coordinates, I said. And send a decent vehicle. I'm not driving my old pickup to Vegas. Vegas. The irony that the loudest, brightest place on earth sat just a few hours' drive from the quietest, most terrifying place in America. I spent the next few hours packing a bag that felt like it belonged to a ghost. I didn't pack summer clothes. I packed my old leather jacket, the one that smelled of mildew and sleepless nights in cars. I knew that in the desert, the night cold was just as treacherous as the daytime heat. The flight was quick, but time seemed to slow to a crawl inside my head. I was heading back into the personal hell I'd tried to forget. When I landed in Nevada, the air hit me like a punch. Dry, hot, with that metallic smell, half dust, half ozone. A smell I associated with things that shouldn't be happening. I was picked up by an unmarked black Jeep, driven by a kid who looked fresh out of a military academy. Smooth face, no lines of worry. He didn't say a word. Neither did I. The silence of the desert is different from the silence of a forest. In a forest, silence is full of hidden life. In the desert, silence is absence. It's the promise that nothing survives there except what's too hard to die. As we left the main road and turned onto those dirt tracks, the sun began to set, painting the mountains in violent reds and oranges. The mountains looked like exposed bones. Cracked, dry earth, where every plant seemed to be screaming in pain. We reached the forward command post when night had already swallowed everything. It wasn't a base. It was a rusted trailer, poorly lit by a noisy generator, surrounded by radio antennas that looked like thorns. The FCP sat in a depression, about 30 kilometers from what was officially Area 731. The place where Miller vanished was even more isolated, in what they called Ground Zero Delta. The first person to greet me wasn't an FBI agent or a soldier. It was a civilian. A thin man with glasses, disheveled hair, who looked like he'd spent the last 3 days drinking coffee and staring at monitors. Dr. Hayes. Hayes didn't shake my hand. He just nodded and led me straight into the trailer, which reeked of hot electronics and desperation. Arthur Vance, he said quietly, almost conspiratorially. I'm glad you came. I thought they were going to leave me here alone to lose my mind. Where's Miller? I went straight to the point. Hayes pointed to a metal table scattered with Miller's belongings, a broken radio, a battered notebook, and a Geiger counter that was on, but not making the usual radiation clicks. It was just blinking. Agent Miller was tracking a seismic anomaly pattern he called an energy echo. He was convinced that the Operation Teapot tests in the 1950s created a kind of subsurface resonance that never dissipated. I know what he was looking for, Doctor. Tell me what found him. Hayes rubbed his face, looking exhausted. What found him was silence. He stopped responding on the radio. We found his Jeep abandoned about 5 kilometers from Delta's epicenter. But equipment was outside. And this was with him. He picked up Miller's notebook and handed it to me. Sam's handwriting was unmistakable, always firm, always orderly. But the last pages were chaos. He'd drawn diagrams that looked like sound waves or frequencies, but in the middle were scribbles of something that looked like a person. Or a ghost. And at the center of it all, a single sentence written in large, frantic letters. Time is broken. They are trapped here. My stomach twisted. Miller didn't scare easily. He didn't spook at shadows or strange noises. If he wrote this, it meant he'd seen something that broke him. What the hell is residual resonance, Hayes? We think it's the signature of the released energy. It isn't ionizing radiation. It isn't heat. It's something that affects time and space locally, Hayes explained, walking over to a monitor showing a graph that looked like the EKG of a dying heart. Look at this, Vance. These are electromagnetic pulse readings from the Delta area. No storms. No radio interference. But the field is fluctuating wildly. And every 23 minutes and 12 seconds, we get a spike that lasts about 4 seconds. What happens during that spike? Hayes looked at me over the rim of his glasses, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in his eyes. During that spike, Arthur, time behaves like rubber. It stretches. Or it bends. Our surveillance drones stopped functioning. The last one we sent in recorded a 5-minute lapse. 5 minutes that simply vanished. Then the feed came back, but the drone was 50 meters away from where it should have been. And the dust on the ground looked like it had been disturbed by footsteps. Footsteps from who? We don't know. Agent Miller went out there alone, with authorization from Davis, to investigate these temporal lapses. He believed the energy from the nuclear tests created a kind of time bubble that opens and closes, and that something, or someone, is trapped inside it. I took a slow breath, trying to absorb the insanity of it. Atomic bombs causing temporal ghosts. It sounded like a B-movie plot, but coming from Sam Miller, it was terrifyingly real. And the equipment you found, were there signs of a struggle? Hayes shook his head. No. The Jeep was clean. But we found this about 10 meters from where the vehicle was parked. That's what made us call Davis. He led me to a clear plastic container, where an object rested on a sterile cloth. It was a brass compass. The kind used on ships or for land navigation before the 1950s. What's wrong with a compass? It's not the compass, Vance. It's what was attached to it. Look closely. I leaned in. A strip of fabric, thin, frayed, gray, was snagged on the side of the brass. It looked like wool from an old uniform. Miller didn't carry anything like that. And there's no one else in Area 731, right? Correct. And the compass needle, Hayes hesitated, pointing. It's not pointing to magnetic north. It's pointing straight down. Directly into the ground. I touched the glass of the container, feeling the weight of that piece of metal. That compass wasn't just an object. It was an anchor for something that shouldn't exist. Tell me exactly where he disappeared. I need to go to Ground Zero Delta. Hayes tried to argue about the energy spikes and the danger of approaching the area at night, but I cut him off. Doctor, you said time is broken out there. If Miller is trapped in one of those bubbles, I can't wait for sunrise. The bubble could close completely. Or move. I need to go now before the next spike. Hayes sighed, defeated. He handed me a crude map and a satellite radio. The next spike is in 20 minutes, Vance. Try not to be there when it happens. And take this meter. He passed me another device, more complex than a standard Geiger counter. It measures temporal distortion. If the red bar rises, run. You're about to encounter something that doesn't belong in our time. I took the equipment and the flashlight. Nevada dust was already clinging to my jacket. The ozone smell was stronger. I was back in the game. I took the Jeep the young driver had brought, started the engine, and pulled away from the trailer. The faint light of the forward command post vanished behind me, and I was alone in the deepest darkness I had ever felt. The road barely existed, just 2 worn tracks in gravel. I drove slowly, sweeping the flashlight across the terrain. The desert at night is treacherous, cold, silent, and the darkness feels heavy. As I drove, I thought about Miller. What had he seen? What had he discovered that made him write that desperate sentence? Report 731. I remembered the pages describing secondary effects of the 1955 tests. Scientists had noted inconsistent variations in local magnetism and unexplained fluctuations in air temperature unrelated to meteorological conditions. They dismissed it as equipment error. Miller knew it wasn't. I reached Ground Zero Delta. The site was marked by a wooden post that looked like it had taken a glancing bullet. Vegetation was nearly non-existent. The soil was a sickly pale gray. I stopped the Jeep and killed the engine. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of an Oregon lake. It was oppressive, as if sound itself were being pulled into the ground. I grabbed Miller's radio, his notebook, and the temporal distortion meter. The red bar was steady. Not yet. I stepped out of the Jeep. The air was cold now, sharp. The moon was nearly full, but its light seemed weak, as though it were fighting the darkness itself. I found the exact spot where Miller's Jeep had been left. Fresh tire tracks marked the sand. I switched on the flashlight and swept the ground. There were no signs of a struggle. But there was something else. Something stranger. About 10 meters away, the sand looked different. As if the dust had been swept or compacted into an odd pattern. Concentric circles. I moved closer, cautiously. As I examined the sand, the temporal distortion meter in my hand began to vibrate. I looked down. The red bar was rising. 20 minutes, Hayes had said. I had maybe 5 minutes before the next pulse. Static electricity prickled in the air, raising the hair on my arms. The ozone smell became unbearable, like lightning had just struck beside me. I glanced at my watch. The pulse was coming. I started running away from the concentric circles, trying to get clear of Delta's epicenter. I had to be outside the bubble when it opened. I wasn't fast enough. The ground began to shake, but not like an earthquake. It was a low hum, vibrating through my bones. I dropped to the ground, covering my head. When I looked up, the world had changed. The moonlight, once faint, became intense, almost white, but it didn't illuminate. It revealed. In the center of the concentric circles, the air began to ripple like heat rising off hot asphalt, except it was night. And cold. The rippling intensified, and the hum turned into a piercing, unbearable shriek. Then I saw it. It wasn't a hole in the ground. It was a hole in the air. A fissure, a black crack in the fabric of reality, swallowing light. Inside it, moving slowly, were shapes. Shadows, but shaped like men. Military uniforms, faded and gray, as if made of smoke and dust. They were frozen in time, caught in postures of confusion and panic. I saw one soldier groping for a rifle that wasn't there. Another had his hands on his face, as if screaming, but no sound came. They were ghosts. The ghosts of the blast. Trapped in the instant the shockwave hit them, but displaced in time, in a place that opened and closed. The ozone smell was overwhelming. The temporal distortion meter was going wild, the red bar flashing like an emergency beacon. I was about to run, to scramble back to the Jeep and call Davis, tell him Miller was lost in time and this was a job for someone in a lead helmet, not me. Then one of the ghosts moved. Not like a shadow. Like a real man, still smoky, still unreal but deliberate. It turned. And it wasn't a soldier from 1955. The spectral figure wore a dark leather jacket. Familiar. One hand was outstretched, as if reaching for something. I saw the face, or the lack of it. It was distorted, pulled in opposite directions, but I recognized the build. The height. It was Sam Miller. He wasn't just trapped. He was trying to get out. As the fissure began to close, Miller's ghost made a sudden motion. His vapor-thin hand stretched outward and threw something from the object hit the ground in front of me with a dull clink, and the fissure snapped shut with a violent crack, like the air being whipped apart. The electricity vanished. Silence returned, heavier and deadlier than before. I crawled to the object. It was a piece of metal. A military dog tag. I picked it up. It was ice cold, even in the desert's residual heat. It wasn't Miller's tag. It was far older, rusted, worn. I wiped away the dust with my thumb and read the name engraved. Corporal Robert J. Smith. Operation Teapot, 1955. I flipped the tag over. No contact information. Just a set of coordinates, scratched hastily into the metal. And beneath the coordinates, a single word, written with the same frantic urgency I'd seen in Miller's notebook. Vance. He knew I'd come. He was waiting for me. And he'd given me the key, the coordinates of where they were trapped. I stood there, the cold metal heavy in my hand. I was no longer searching for a missing colleague. I was stepping into a ghost hunt, and the ghosts knew my name. I had just realized Miller wasn't the victim. He was the guide. And he was in a place where time no longer existed. I had to bring him back. Or join him. And the coordinates were calling me toward the heart of Nevada's madness. I was at the beginning of the road, and the only thing I knew for certain was this: Report 731 was real. And whatever was trapped out there was watching me. The coordinate Miller gave me was like a knife on the map, pointing straight at the heart of the Nevada test site, a place the government had promised was clean for decades, but that everyone knew was the birthplace of nightmares. I picked up the rental car, an old but reliable SUV, and stocked it with fuel, water, and the equipment Miller had left behind. A Geiger counter that looked like it came straight out of the 1950s and a ruggedized military laptop. I didn't need weapons. If Report 731 was right, I wouldn't be fighting men. I'd be fighting time. At first, the road was cracked asphalt, lined with dry brush and the smell of hot dust. But the deeper I drove into the desert, the more the road disintegrated into gravel tracks and sand. The landscape was oppressively silent. No birds. No insects. The desert was mute, as if life itself had learned to hold its breath there. I passed rusted signs warning of radioactive danger and federal property. The Nevada sun is brutal, but that day it felt like it was watching me, not warming me. When I reached the inner perimeter, where the barbed wire fence had collapsed and been eaten away by rust, I stopped. I was no longer on a road. I was in a sea of red sand. I switched on the Geiger counter. The sound started immediately, a slow, steady click, like an old clock. Not loud enough to be immediately lethal, but a constant reminder that I was walking on the ashes of war. I drove for another hour, following the GPS to Miller's exact coordinates. And then I saw it. It wasn't a bunker. It wasn't a building. It was a scar in the earth. The ground dropped sharply into a massive circular depression, larger than any conventional bomb crater I'd ever seen in photographs. It looked as if a giant had dug a deep hole and then filled it with pulverized sand. But what made me stop the car and feel my throat tighten wasn't the size. It was the color. The sand at the center wasn't red or brown. It was a milky white, almost pale gray, and it seemed to vibrate under the distorted heat. I stopped about 300 meters from the edge of the depression. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was as if sound itself had been swallowed. I could hear my own heart pounding in my chest, but the wind, whipping the car moments earlier, was gone. I got out of the vehicle. The heat hit me like a punch. I raised the binoculars. And that's when I saw Miller's camp. It was a mess. Not the kind of camp you set up to spend the night. It looked like he'd built a field laboratory. Metal tripods lay overturned, cables were scattered everywhere, and a torn gray tarp was clumsily anchored to a few rocks. But what caught my attention was the large, portable satellite dish, aimed directly at the center of the crater. Miller hadn't been trying to listen for radio transmissions or aliens. He was trying to map something. I descended the slope carefully, loose sand sliding under my boots. The Geiger counter went crazy. The clicks turned into a continuous, rapid buzz, like a machine gun. I was right in the middle of what the government politely called a hot zone. When I reached what remained of Miller's camp, the smell hit me. Not just dust or ozone. It was metallic and sour, as if electricity had burned the air itself. I looked for Miller. Nothing. What I did find was his military laptop, partially buried in the sand but still running. The screen flickered, showing a data graph that didn't make immediate sense, electromagnetic energy spikes mixed with radiation readings that rose and fell chaotically. Beside the laptop was a digital audio recorder. I picked it up. It was warm to the touch. I sat down in the sand, ignoring the radioactive dust, and pressed play. Miller's voice came through, tired but excited. Log 48. Vance, if you're hearing this, I went too far. I don't know how much time has passed since Log 47. Time here isn't linear. I'm seeing echoes. He paused. I could hear his heavy breathing and the frantic clicking of the Geiger counter in the background. The Grable test in 1953, the underground detonation, wasn't contained. The megaton-level energy didn't just vaporize the ground. It opened a scar. Report 731 was right. The pressure and temperature created a localized temporal singularity. They're calling it a pulse rift. A chill ran through me despite the desert heat. A temporal rift. What's trapped here, Arthur, aren't ghosts in the spiritual sense. They're ghosts in the physical sense. Energy echoes. Moments torn out of the flow and trapped in a microsecond loop. They're repeating the last moments of their lives. The scientists, the soldiers, the security personnel, everyone who was too close when the ground shook. Miller coughed, sounding exhausted. I tried to stabilize the readings, but the rift is expanding. I saw one of them today. A soldier. He was burnt. He didn't see me, but I felt his heat. He was screaming, Arthur. But the sound wasn't coming from now. It was coming from 70 years ago. The audio cut off in a burst of violent static. I rewound and played it again. The sound was real. I looked at the white crater in front of me. If Miller was right, this place wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a broken time machine, and the souls trapped there were caught in an infinite cycle of agony. I needed to find the exact point where Miller disappeared. I stood and followed the remains of Miller's cables, which led straight toward the center of the crater. With every step, the buzzing of my Geiger counter intensified. The center of the depression was the strangest place I had ever stood. The sand was as fine as ash. My boots sank into it. I looked up at the sky, clear, a deep blue, but the air above the crater shimmered, like heat rising off a blazing grill. Then it happened. It wasn't a sound. It was a sensation. The air suddenly became heavy, dense, as if atmospheric pressure had increased tenfold in an instant. I smelled gunpowder and hot metal. And I saw it. It wasn't a mirage. It wasn't an optical illusion. About 20 meters away, in the middle of the white sand, a figure appeared. Transparent, like an image projected onto smoke, but perfectly defined. It was a man wearing a U.S. Army officer's uniform from the 1950s. He stood there, staring up at the sky. I couldn't make out his facial features, but his posture was pure terror. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. The ghost, or echo, as Miller called it, began to tremble. A very low, high-pitched vibration filled the air, a sound that felt like it was coming from inside my head rather than from the outside world. The officer raised a hand, shielding his eyes. And then I heard it. A countdown, raspy, distant, but unmistakable. The officer staggered. The world turned white. It wasn't sunlight. It was an internal light erupting from the center of the crater. A silent explosion of brightness so intense it burned my eyes, even though I instinctively squeezed them shut. I felt a wave of heat that wasn't natural, but artificial, like standing too close to a nuclear reactor. And then, as quickly as it came, it was gone. I opened my eyes, coughing. The sand was boiling. The silence returned, now filled only by the deafening sound of my own blood pounding. The officer was gone. There was no trace of him. I dropped to my knees, struggling to breathe. That hadn't been a memory. That was the past breaking into the present. The rift was active. I grabbed Miller's recorder and pressed record. I had to document this, even if no one ever believed it. Log entry, Arthur Vance. Location, coordinates 731. I've just witnessed a pulse event. A temporal echo of an officer at the moment of detonation. The energy is tangible. Miller wasn't crazy. I stopped, swallowing hard. I had to steady myself. I was a former FBI agent, trained to face the worst humanity had to offer. But no matter how bad humanity got, it still followed the rules of physics. This place didn't. I crawled to the spot where the officer had appeared. There, partially buried, was what Miller had been searching for. It was a data recording module, similar to an aircraft's black box, but far more robust. A thick cable connected it to a sensor fused into a slab of melted concrete. I dug it out and connected it to Miller's laptop. The screen flickered, then a new data interface appeared. It was a map of the rift. Miller had managed to chart the anomaly. It wasn't random. It was a vortex. The map showed energy converging at a specific point about 50 meters farther in what appeared to be the epicenter of the original detonation, what Miller called Ground Zero. Ground Zero was marked with a flashing icon. And next to it was a reading that sent ice through my veins. Miller's vest signal location, Ground Zero. Depth, 12 meters. Miller was down there. Trapped. The recorder was still running. I turned up the volume. Log 51. I've reached Ground Zero. Radiation levels are insane. But the anomaly, it's pulling. It's not just the past. It's possibility. It's like every moment that could have been, and every moment that is bleeding together. I'm seeing the city. Nevada City, but not the one we know. A version erased from the map in 1957. They're all here. The people. Miller's voice was ragged, barely above a whisper. I made a mistake, Arthur. The rift doesn't trap. It consumes. And I think it wants me. The vest, the battery's dying. I'm going down. I have to record what they did. If I don't come back, you have to close this. Report 731 has the method, the inverse frequency. It's in my inner pocket, an encrypted memory card. Don't let this spread. Don't let time break. The audio ended with a guttural sound, a muffled scream, and then silence. Miller had gone down. He'd entered the rift. I stared at Ground Zero. There was no visible hole, just white sand. But the map showed the underground structure, what remained of the original monitoring bunker, directly beneath the temporal vortex. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky orange and purple. But the light in that place, the rift's light, never changed. It remained a dull gray white. I stood in the middle of a cemetery of temporal ghosts, and my partner was trapped 12 meters below me. I got to my feet. I had the equipment. I had proof. And now I had a mission: go down. I glanced at my car, which felt like a point of safety an entire universe away. I could leave. I could take the laptop, the recorder, the data module, and hand everything over to the government. I'd be a hero or a madman, but I'd be alive. But Miller's scream, his final sound, echoed in my head. He trusted me to shut this down. And I couldn't leave one of our own, an FBI agent, to rot in a temporal nightmare. I searched what was left of the camp, looking for anything Miller might have used to descend. Under the torn tarp, I found it, a manual winch and heavy climbing cables. He'd planned the descent. But where? I used a portable metal detector at ground zero. It shrieked immediately. There was a large metal mass, possibly a hatch or access cover, buried less than a meter down. I grabbed an emergency shovel Miller had left behind and started digging. The white sand was disturbingly easy to move. After 15 minutes of exhausting work, weighed down by radiation and dread, the shovel struck something hard and cold. A thick, circular steel plate, with a rusted metal handle in the center. A subterranean bunker hatch. I pulled on the handle. It wouldn't budge, welded shut by decades of rust and sediment. I went back to the car and grabbed a crowbar. I used every ounce of strength I had, my body screaming in protest. With a loud groan of tearing metal, the hatch shifted open a few centimeters. The smell that rose from below was damp earth, mold, and something else, something electrical and rotten. I forced it wider and heaved the cover aside. A black void opened beneath me, plunging into absolute darkness. I switched on my flashlight. The beam revealed a vertical metal ladder descending into a narrow, damp tunnel. An old access shaft for the scientists who once monitored the underground tests. I anchored the climbing rope to the winch and secured the other end to a solid rock outcrop. I didn't trust the rusted ladder. I looked down. I was about to enter a place physics had forgotten. I put on Miller's vest, lying near the laptop. A small tracking sensor was attached. I activated it. I was ready. I began to descend, the flashlight cutting through the dark. The air below was cold and heavy. With every meter I dropped, the buzzing of my Geiger counter weakened, which made no sense. I'd expected higher radiation underground. Then I understood. The rift was at the epicenter. The radiation above was residue from the past. Down here, I was entering the heart of the anomaly, where the rules of matter and time dissolved. I descended at least 10 meters until my boots hit cold concrete. I stood in a corridor, narrow, reinforced concrete walls slick with mold and moisture. The flashlight showed a low ceiling, the passage stretching left and right. On the wall directly ahead was a faded symbol, a triangle enclosing a number. 7. 3. 1. Report 731 wasn't just a document. It was the name of the complex. I was at the heart of nuclear madness. I looked at Miller's tracker. The signal was weak, but it was coming from the left. I started walking, my footsteps echoing through the silent corridor. With every step, the temperature dropped. It wasn't just cold, it was a cold that drained heat straight from my skin. I began to see the first signs that Miller had been here. Small chalk marks on the floor, indicating electromagnetic field readings. I turned a corner and entered a larger room that looked like a communications hub. Rusted metal consoles lined the walls, chairs knocked over and abandoned. And in the middle of the room, there was something that made me stop and raise my flashlight. It was a visual anomaly. On the opposite wall, the concrete was gone. In its place was an area about 2 square meters wide that looked like it was made of water. It shimmered, but it wasn't wet. I moved closer, slowly. It was the rift. Not a portal, a window. Through that watery membrane, I could see what looked like the same room, but intact. The lights were on, glowing a weak yellow. Men in white lab coats sat at the consoles, working frantically. It looked like the night before the test. I could hear a low hum coming from the wall, but not the sounds of the room itself. The rift was visual. The sound was warped. I extended my hand, hesitating. I was inches away from touching the past. My hand met cold air. The texture was like dry ice, dense, resistant. As I watched, one of the men in lab coats, a scientist with thick glasses, lifted his head. He was pale and sweating. He looked toward my side of the room, directly at where I stood. He didn't see me. I knew he couldn't. But he was looking into the future. And then he spoke. The voice didn't come from the wall, but from inside the room, as if he were whispering directly into my ear. It's almost time. The energy, it's too much. It's not going to work. He was talking about the test. The detonation that would create the rift. Suddenly, the image on the wall began to distort, like a stone dropped into a lake. The scientist screamed, a silent scream to me, and the image dissolved into psychedelic colors before snapping back into damp concrete. The rift had closed. Or shifted. I stepped back, breathing hard. I was watching their deaths in real time. I checked Miller's tracker. The signal was stronger now. I was close. The corridor continued, and I followed it until I reached a massive steel door, partially open. I pushed it. The door creaked, and I stepped into the final room. It was an underground laboratory. In the center stood a large metal table covered in monitoring equipment that looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. And Miller was there. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't well. He was slumped against the wall, sitting on the floor with his knees drawn up. He was pale, coated in white dust from the crater sand. One hand clutched his chest, his eyes open. "Miller!" I rushed to him. "Ah, you came," he whispered. His voice was thin, like paper. I knelt beside him. "What happened? Where's the card?" "Report 731, the inverse frequency." He shook his head. "It's not the frequency, Arthur. It's not a code. It's a sacrifice." He coughed, dark blood staining his lips. "I found the source. Ground Zero isn't the center of the explosion. It's the center of the temporal fusion. Time is folding in on itself here. And they're angry." "Who, Miller?" "The ghosts. They're not just ghosts. They're fragments of souls. And they want out. They want to fill the void. I tried to close it, but the rift, it feeds on energy. And I gave it everything I had." He pointed to the wall behind him. I raised my flashlight. And there, in the concrete, was the largest and most stable temporal anomaly I had seen yet. It was a spinning vortex of gray and black light, like a sandstorm in slow motion. Not a window. A hole. And inside it I could see something. Not people, structures. A ghost city made of light and shadow, replaying a single day in 1957. Figures were moving toward the edge of the hole. Not faint echoes, three-dimensional forms, nearly solid, emerging from the turbulence. Miller grabbed my arm. His skin was ice cold. "The card, it's with me. But don't close it yet. The rift has to stabilize. They're coming, Arthur. They're coming into our time. I saw the future. If they get out, time will break forever." I looked at the vortex. The figures were closer now. I could make out faces frozen in panic and pain, trapped at the instant of their destruction. Miller was dying. I had to get him out. "We're leaving, Miller. I'll get you topside." "There's no time," he said weakly. He struggled to reach into the inner pocket of his vest. He pulled out a small memory card, glinting in the flashlight beam. "Report 731. The inverse frequency. You have to inject it into the center of the pulse. You have to give them what they want, Arthur. Energy. But enough energy to collapse the system." He pressed the card into my hand. My fingers trembled as I took it. Miller smiled, a sad, resigned smile. "I'm sorry, Arthur. I couldn't make it back." With a final breath, the life left Miller's body. I stayed there, kneeling beside my friend's corpse, the memory card burning in my hand. The vortex in the wall began to roar. The sound was audible now, a deep suction noise, like a jet engine. The figures were almost through. I stood up, adrenaline flooding my veins. I had to honor Miller's death. I grabbed the laptop and connected the memory card. The screen flickered, displaying a single file, Omega Protocol. I looked at the hole in the wall. I had to reach the center of the vortex, inject the protocol, and shut Report 731 down forever. But the path was blocked. One of the figures, a shirtless man with burned skin and empty eyes, had fully emerged from the rift. He was wet, coated in a substance that looked like water mixed with dust, and he was staring straight at me. He was the first ghost of Nevada solid enough to touch. And he was coming toward me. I was trapped underground with a body and a portal to temporal hell. I had the knowledge, but not the power. And the past was hungry. I had to fight the ghosts to save the future. The descent was over. The war was beginning. The descent was hell. There was no other word for it. When I kicked open the steel door leading to sublevel 3, the air hit me like a punch. It wasn't just the smell of burnt ozone and old concrete dust. It was the feeling that time itself was leaking the wrong way. I stepped into the darkness, my flashlight swinging. The corridor was narrow, cluttered with rusted crates and cables that looked like dried veins. And the silence was the worst part. It wasn't normal silence. It was a silence that swallowed sound, a vacuum where physics seemed tired of working. I had to find Mark. What I found first was the sound. A low, electrical hum coming from the end of the corridor. It sounded like a million bees trapped inside a high-voltage transformer. I knew that was it, the heart of the anomaly, the place where Report 731 came alive. I reached a circular chamber, larger than a gymnasium. At its center stood a structure that looked like it had been built to restrain an angry god. It was a tangled mass of enormous copper coils, 1950s-era control panels blinking with lights, and at the very center of it all, a strange glow. It wasn't light from a bulb. It was light that seemed stolen from somewhere else, or some other time. And there was Mark. He was standing near the main control panel, wearing the same dirty beige uniform, but he was different. He wasn't operating the machine. He was just standing there, almost fused to it. "Mark!" I shouted. My voice sounded thin and ridiculous in that cavernous space. Mark turned slowly. His eyes were open, but empty, like windows in an abandoned house. He had a scraggly beard, but what truly frightened me was the smile. It wasn't relief at seeing me. It was the smile of someone who had gotten the joke, and the joke was deadly. "Arthur, you took your time," he said. His voice was sluggish, as if he were speaking through water. "Where were you? What is this? What happened to the report?" I pointed at the humming, glowing machine. Mark took a step back, shielding the panel. "The report is the truth, Arthur. They didn't just blow up the ground. They blew up time. The Sedan test, the B8 test, those explosions opened the door." He gestured toward the central light. And then I saw it. They weren't just flashes. They were silhouettes. The ghosts the sheriff had seen, the images I had sensed. But here, they were sharper. Scientists in white lab coats, soldiers frozen in panic, and worst of all, a whole family, trapped in the blast maybe 400 meters from ground zero, now caught in a temporal loop. They were there, silent, burning forever. "They're trapped, Arthur. Report 731 isn't about radiation, it's about the echo of radiation. The energy signature that remains when time is torn. And this machine," Mark struck the control panel, "is what keeps the rift stable. A temporal fissure stabilizer." My stomach twisted. "You're telling me you're down here keeping hell open?" "I'm keeping it contained," Mark snapped, tension creeping into his voice. "If I shut it down, if I stop feeding it residual energy, the rift collapses. And when it collapses, it won't just take those echoes. It'll take us too. It'll be like we never existed." I looked at the silent figures. They seemed to beg for peace. "You can't stay here, Mark. The government declared you missing. This is insanity." "Insanity?" Mark laughed, a dry, horrible sound. "I saw what they did here, Arthur. They tried to weaponize it. They wanted to send messages into the past, maybe. All they managed to do was build an eternal prison. I'm the warden now. If I leave, who's to say the rift won't expand and swallow the world outside?" I knew Mark was broken, but he wasn't lying about the danger. The energy in the room was rising. The hum turned into a piercing shriek. My skin prickled as if my own atoms were coming apart. "I'm not leaving you here," I said, taking a cautious step forward. You have to go, Arthur. You have the knowledge. You read the report. Get out and tell them what really happened. The problem was, I was a former FBI agent, not a quantum physicist. I couldn't just accept that my friend had become the guardian of a prison full of temporal ghosts. I drew my gun. Not to shoot Mark, but to show I was serious. We're leaving together. Now step away from the panel. Mark shook his head, pure sadness on his face. I knew you'd do this. Suddenly, the room filled with movement. Not Mark, but the echoes. The temporal shadows, once motionless, surged toward us, accelerating. They weren't ghosts with floating sheets. They were distortions of light and time, and they were furious. They feel the instability, Arthur. When you get close, the energy fluctuates. Mark shouted. The silhouette of a soldier with a melted helmet passed through me. I felt an impossible cold, a vacuum of heat that made me stagger. It wasn't physical, it was the absence of warmth, the absence of life. I fired. The shot hit the control panel, far from Mark. A shower of blue sparks exploded. The high-pitched hum became a deafening screech. What did you do? Mark yelled, snapping fully out of his trance as he rushed toward the damaged panel. I'm not leaving you here. If this is a prison, we tear down the walls. I knew I was doing the most dangerous thing of my life. I was forcing the implosion Mark feared. The machine began to tear itself apart. The copper cables vibrated violently, and the central light pulsed, alternating between blinding white and absolute black. The floor shook. The rift, it's closing. Time is correcting itself. Mark shouted, looking at me with a mix of horror and understanding. The temporal echoes, the ghosts of the Cold War, began to writhe. They weren't advancing anymore. They were being dragged backward, pulled toward the origin point of the explosion, toward the exact moment of their deaths. It was as if the tape of time was being violently rewound, and they were images trapped inside it. Come on, Mark. Now or never. I grabbed his arm. Mark resisted for a second, staring at the center of the chamber. I saw tears in his eyes. He wasn't crying for himself. He was crying for the condemned, those he was freeing, or perhaps erasing forever. Goodbye, 731, he whispered. I pulled him with all the strength I had. We ran back down the corridor as the bunker collapsed around us. The sound was overwhelming. No longer electrical hums, but stone pulverizing, metal tearing. It was the sound of time stitching itself back together. We climbed the stairs. With each step, the pressure in my chest grew heavier. I could feel the anomaly trying to hold us, trying to drag us back into limbo. We reached the steel hatch. I shoved it open, and Mark crawled out first, coughing up radioactive dust and desert air. I was last. The moment my boots hit the desert floor, the steel hatch slammed shut behind me with a monumental crash. And then, silence. This time, it was real silence. Desert wind. The sound of my own ragged breathing. The electrical hum was gone. That weight, that sense that something fundamental in the universe was broken, had vanished. I turned around. The ground where the bunker entrance had been was now a smoking depression. There was no structure left. The earth had swallowed the wound. I dropped to my knees, exhausted. Mark lay on his back, staring at the stars beginning to appear overhead. It's over, he said, his voice hoarse but clear. It's over, I agreed. We stayed there for a long time. The sun began to rise, painting the sky orange and purple. That dawn felt brighter, more real, than any I had ever seen. Mark stood first. He was pale and thin, but the emptiness in his eyes was gone. He was Mark again. We have to go. Cleanup will start soon, he said. I knew he was right. The government wouldn't ignore a structural collapse. They'd send teams to investigate a seismic failure. And we were both loose ends. We started walking. The trek back to where I'd left the Jeep felt endless, but with every step, the weight of that place faded. We found the Jeep exactly where I'd left it. The first thing Mark did was turn on the radio. Pop music spilled out, normal, banal sound that nearly made me cry with relief. What do we say? I asked as I drove us out of the restricted zone, ignoring the barbed wire. Mark looked at me. We tell them the truth they can accept. I was kidnapped by a rogue group trying to restart an old, unstable reactor. You found me, saved my life, and we escaped before the facility imploded due to nuclear instability. And Report 731? Report 731? It's just a document on residual radiation effects, Arthur. A document that needs to be filed and forgotten. No one will believe a temporal rift. No one can. He smiled again, but this time it was melancholic. We saw what happens when humans try to play God with time. They don't need to know the Cold War's ghosts were finally set free. We drove for hours. When we finally reached Las Vegas, the city felt like a loud, unreal circus. I handed Mark over to a trusted military hospital, backed by a flawless cover story we'd rehearsed until it was airtight. He would be rehabilitated, evaluated, and eventually sent home. And me? I went back to my apartment in Los Angeles. The FBI welcomed me as a hero. I had tracked down a missing agent under dangerous circumstances and ensured sensitive information didn't fall into the wrong hands, which was technically true, since the sensitive information was that the desert had a temporal scar. I filed my final report, archived as the Vance 731 Recovery Report. I used every skill I had to omit the truth without lying outright. I talked about radiation, instability, danger. But the ghosts? They stayed buried. I retired. Truly retired this time. The Nevada desert gave me more than I could ever endure. Today, I'm just Arthur Vance, a man who drinks coffee on his porch. But every night when I look up at the sky, I don't just see stars. I see the absolute darkness that once lived at the heart of that bunker. And sometimes, when the wind blows a certain way, I feel it again, that cold, that vacuum of heat. A reminder. Report 731 may have been archived, the temporal rift may have been stitched shut, and the ghosts may have found peace. But the desert keeps its secrets. And I'm the only one who knows that beneath that sand, the fissure still exists. It's only sleeping. And every day, I pray that no one ever tries to wake it again. Because I know what happens when the past refuses to die. And I won't be there to close the doors a second time. I've done my part. The desert one. And I, by luck alone, managed to escape. But the dust of that place, my friends, never leaves the soul. Never.